going to make some brief intro remarks. Are we good for people online? Yeah, Mike. Okay. Yep. Welcome everybody. Good to see all of you in person. Welcome to the space. We're excited to welcome Public Digital today to an event, hopefully for folks that were part of the lightning talks earlier today. That was useful and fun, and hopefully everybody got to hear some useful stories about our experiences across organizational transformation, building capacity in government institutions, delivery in crisis situations, delivery at scale. So we're now going to go into, I think, a pretty exciting session to dive deep into one of those programs with Laura and Martel, and make yourself at home. And for those of you physically here, hope to do this more and see you all at the happy hour afterwards. Thanks.
Thank you, Roland. So Laura and I have been chatting since the talks earlier today, and we have prepped many questions for each other. So we have them right here. But we'll start with some introductions in case some of you were not able to attend the sessions earlier. So I'm Martel Esposito. I use pronouns she and her, and I am the partnerships and evaluation lead at Nava, which for those of you who don't know, although many of you do know, Nava is a public benefit corporation. We design digital services with government agencies that are simple, accessible, and effective. And we are implementers. We deliver services for our government partners. Our origins are in HealthCare.gov, but we have expanded our work since then to many state and federal agencies. So I'll pass it off to Laura to introduce herself.
Thank you, Martel. Hi, everybody. I am Laura Sampson. I am a partner at Public Digital, where I joined coming up for a year ago. My background is largely in UK public service. So a little bit about Public Digital, which many of you may not know so much about. So we are a digital transformation consultancy. We work with global institutions that matter, that do good, important stuff. And we work with them to kind of help them be successful and thrive in what we describe as kind of the internet era. Helping them be modern, successful organizations. The origins of Public Digital actually are largely driven by the founders. Ben is here today as one of those founders, who many of you will know as having set up government digital services in the UK originally, and therefore you can tell from that our background and our interests are also come very much from helping government organisations transform for internet era ways of working. That's us, and we're going to seamlessly move on to our very natural conversation.
So, Laura, today you shared about how universal credit went from failure to success. Can you give us a little more background about what universal credit is and what it actually does for people?
Yeah, thank you, Martel, and thank you for the planted question, which is in no small part a bit of a reflection actually on the kind of difference in language between the UK and the States. So I talked a bit this morning about kind of welfare, which is basically, so universal credit is a major transformation of welfare services in the UK, and by welfare we basically mean the largely financial support that we give to people who are on low income or unemployed. Universal credit effectively collapses 6 benefits into a single benefit. So that means that when you are on a low income or unemployed, you you can claim financial support that covers everything in one benefit. So that covers housing, health and disability, children, and your kind of partnership status. and it brings it all into one service that then responds to your circumstances as it changes, and most significantly responds in fact to your earnings data as it changes, so that if you move out of work, getting into work doesn't require you to end one benefit and start another. So it's very dynamic, and its ultimate purpose is actually to make work pay and for it to be easy to go into work and try work. It has, because it brings all of those benefits together, it has pretty significant reach. So about a quarter of all households, it's slightly different right now with the pandemic, it will be a bit more, but roughly a quarter of all households will be in receipt of universal credit. You can be in receipt of it for a very long time. It's not necessarily temporary. And obviously, many people receiving it are in a variety of very vulnerable and complex circumstances. So it's very important that the way it's set up is focused around the needs of individual humans at difficult periods of their lives, and not seen just as a set of processes.
Thank you.
So on the subject of exactly that, and we might come on to a little bit later, my reflection this morning that one of the initial challenges for universal credit was like this focus on it as a technological project. And I was really struck this morning when you were talking about the work you've been doing with WIC, that you have this hypothesis that you're majoring on, which is that the creation of an API standard will help join up. Join up. I said join up earlier and everyone went, what's join up? So you say interoperability. So we'll make data interoperable. We would say join it up. So you were talking about this hypothesis, and I'm interested in how you make sure that in doing that work that it is a kind of people-focused piece of work first and enabled by technology and not technology-driven.
Yeah, so very good question. So the origins of this project are actually very much people-driven. The goals of this project are about reducing burden for WIC participants and for staff. And so for those of you that weren't here before, and for those of you that have never met me before, because if you've met me, you've heard about WIC. I will give a very brief overview. So WIC is a public health program. It provides healthy foods, nutrition education, breastfeeding education, and support services and referrals. And so it's a very, more than other benefits programs, it actually has this very human interaction component to it. And because of that, there are many different touch points that participants have with the program. There are also many different challenges with the current ways that technology is implemented through WIC for staff. With the lack of interoperability, they're often having to compensate manually for managing multiple disparate applications, features. And so our goal by doing a demonstration project related to an API standard is to show with actual data burden reduction, to show what was the experience like before, what was the experience like after, to show real impacts on participants and staff. Additionally, there's a component of easier adaptability and autonomy for the program administrators to meet the specific needs of their population. They're not as dependent on the constraints of their MIS system or where they are in the queue to get their request put in for a new feature because they're focusing on a different upgrade to a core system, or they're not as dependent on constraints that they might have by having to come to consensus with other members in their consortium to be able to make changes to their MIS system. So it's very much about people. It sounds very technical. And honestly, I come from more programmatic and policy background, and I had no idea what an API was until I started working at Nava. And then when I learned what it was, and I learned all of the dynamics that were happening within the WIC program, and started understanding what the potential of this had, I was very excited, not because I thought the technology was cool, which it is. I was excited because I felt like this has the potential to solve a lot of problems for people, for actual participants, and for staff. Yeah.
That's great. And I know the product manager for that demonstration project is here. I'm looking forward to finding out how you're going to measure about it.
Yeah. In the interest of moving on to a similar topic about having this initial failure with universal credit because you treated it as a tech project. So I appreciate you seeing a project that we were doing and saying, okay, well, how are you going to mitigate against the failure that you all experienced by focusing on it as a tech project? How did you move it from just a technology project to a successful implementation?
Yeah, so I think, I touched a bit on this morning, but maybe to go into a little bit more detail. I mean, firstly, I think it's really important that for UK government services at the time, I'm going back this has been a long journey. So I'm going back quite a long time to 2013. And at that point, government digital services had created a set of standards and controls that effectively gave it the authority to intervene in projects that were going off track, which is a bit of an understatement, frankly, for where universal credit was. And that authority enabled the complete pausing of a very, very major, very, very public project, and the total reset of it. And the reset, I guess, had at its heart the complete acceptance that if you are, as with WIC, if you are creating a service where the success is predicated on humans behaving in different ways or encouraging them to do different things, the idea that you can sit in an ivory tower, in our case in Whitehall, and write out a set of requirements and hand it to a big IT supplier is plainly ridiculous. And, the fact that it ever happened is in some ways extraordinary. But it did in big time in the UK. And there are some really important principles that the Universal Credit Programme adopted with the help of GDS. And in fact, I personally worked very closely with one of the other founders, Tom Loosemore, you may know him, in creating the kind of foundational set of principles. So I just wanted to kind of recap them a bit because I think it's really important. I found a lot when I was working in UK government that somewhat obviously going into senior leaders saying, you're doing it all wrong is not very helpful if you can't suggest what you might do right. So the creation of some right ideas was really important. And the very quick demonstration that those right ideas would bear fruit was also extremely important. There are a lot of people whose noses were very out of joint and careers were seriously on the line at the time. So the kind of core, we were, in many ways lucky. There were some phenomenal leaders when we went through the reset that made a big difference. And the context for that reset is not always going to be common to every institution. But I do think the principles that we work to can be common, there is a choice. So those were, first of all, embracing this idea that you cannot know the answer. And being brave, that means going to, in our case, ministers, so the elected politicians, and saying we do not know the answers and we need to get used to the fact that we don't know the answers, but here's a plan that shows how we're going to learn. So we adopted terminology, which we called it test and learn. People stood up in UK Parliament and said, we're going to test and learn, we're going to engage users, we're going to work out what they need, we're going to accept things when they don't work. And it was a very public narrative that was very, very helpful. And we started extremely small with 100 users, but we delivered to those 100 users very quickly. Almost every single journey ended up with call this number, like not to the user, I have to say, to an internal user, because that allowed us to start quickly. So getting something out as quickly as possible where we could learn as fast as possible was very important to an extraordinarily complex set of users. When we said we'll be very, very small, but we will not put any barriers in place to who can claim. So we're in a little sub postcode. Every type of edge case claimed in those 100 users, which was the point, right? Because if you don't find your edges, if you don't find what's difficult early, then you're going to build the wrong thing. We were very firm about establishing a multidisciplinary team. And when I say firm, I mean making sure that we had the right people in that team. It was one team to begin with. We had 100% of their time, no doing this on the edge of your desk, and that the people in this team were going to be allowed to make decisions together in the room, because it was a room that everyone was in at that time. And I personally made best friends with my operational delivery colleague who ran all the job centres and service centres in the UK, and remained her best friend throughout, because in fact that is probably my most important personal lesson, is engaging very closely with operational delivery.
And just to highlight, you at the time you were working within the government.
I was working within the Department for Work and Pensions, which runs the welfare, the benefit services. But at the time, with the help of GDS, as it was at that point, we were very clear to be entirely focused on outcomes. Like, everyone wanted us to build a widget. Like, when's the widget going to arrive? And we had a very a kind of program that had phases, saying in this phase we're going to learn this, in that phase we're going to prove this, and it was, as you can imagine, quite very difficult to get a major government department to accept that. But that allowed us to be outcome focused or problem focused. We've got a problem, let's solve the problem, let's not build a widget. And we were very much, in order to be outcome focused, you have to let your scope be determined by what your outcome wants to be. So we were interested in designing the job roles of a new institution as much as we were interested in designing the technology. And those things I think are absolutely at the heart of nearly all now public digital engagements. When we go into clients, these are the things that we're trying to coach in. And I don't want to pretend they're easy at all. They're very difficult, and you have to be pragmatic, and you can't always get them all. But it's a good example of what can be done when you can line them up. And actually, that outcome thing.
I see what we've done here.
Once you remember. But I was really struck this morning with the presentation that we heard about the Californian unemployment service. And it's my reference to widgets, outcomes over widgets. Apologies for my shorthand. But I've been told to build many portals in my time. And I was really struck in that example and really impressed by how the kind of going in idea was, we'll build a tracker, inspired by pizza tracking, but that the team followed the problem. And that's, I think, is quite a hard thing to do, because everyone tends to get obsessed about, but we said we'd build a tracker, and when's the tracker going to arrive? And the arrival of the tracker will be success. And it was really interesting to hear the description that actually successes turns out not to be that particular tracker. And I'm interested in how Nava was able to create the conditions where, in fact, you didn't have the fixation on a solution and were able to follow the problem.
Yeah, well, I think foundational to following the problem was following the data. And the data was very clear that the original problem was no longer the problem, and that there were a lot of new problems that the agency was very interested in, like reducing call volume, reducing fraud, all of these new problems. And by following the data dynamically, the team was able to hone in on a very particular pain point, which was the claim status. So instead of building this whole superficial holistic tracker that may or may not have the details that people actually care about based on what was the problem at the time, they were able to hone in on a very specific part of the process and have great success with it, because at that point, that was what the agency needed. And because that the data was there, they were able to work with the agency to get that done. There was interest to do it. So we don't want to build pizza trackers just to build pizza trackers because it sounds cool and it looks cool. We want to build products that are solving problems, that are having actual impact, that are achieving the outcomes, the desired outcomes of the agencies that we're working with, based on what they need now, not what they needed a year ago. Yeah.
And I think like both of our organizations have experienced, well, I think the people we work with have learned a lot about that during the pandemic, was my reflection from talking to you more generally, that I think, I don't know about what everyone else thinks, but I think the pandemic has helped people learn about the importance to understanding where the problems are and reacting to them.
And I'm gonna speak a little extemporaneously because it wasn't in our original plan discussion, but having having come from more like programmatic and academic settings where like data is not available for like many years until it's like fully cleaned up and perfect and ready to present, you're making decisions based on data that is sometimes 5 years old, sometimes 10 years old. And what was really cool about this project was they were like, we're just going to see what data we have and what we can use to actually make more real-time informed decisions. And I think that's something that we can ponder and think about, of like, maybe our data doesn't have to be perfect. Maybe we should be looking at for purposes of things like responding to a crisis, we need to be more open to less perfect data, but other people may disagree. But that was the reflection of how a lot of times our data, our program data, is many, many years old that we're making decisions on. So, okay, it sounds like both Nava and Public Digital pull on very similar levers of digital transformation, what we've explored earlier today in the lightning talks and this afternoon. Many of you know Nava is an implementer. We design and develop digital services, and many of you know us as that. Public Digital, you know us as that. In your view, how is Public Digital different and complementary to Nava in pulling on these levers?
Yeah, so we had a really interesting discussion actually, by posing that question to ourselves, and a lot of it, I think, has to do with the creating maturity in organizations actually to work in the ways of working that I think we all recognize. Public Digital typically works with institutions that come to us kind of knowing that they need help, wanting to transform, and quite often having actually tried and failed in some form or other already, and knowing that they need help, and where Public Digital comes in, we tend to come in and quite often with an assessment of their current maturity from a kind of digital point of view. And that assessment covers all sorts of things like kind of their culture, their leadership style, their ways of working, how they fund things, how they govern things. And we will look across that kind of whole spectrum in respect of what they want to achieve, and very often have to deliver quite difficult message. I mean, one of the reasons I joined Public Digital is because it just says it how it is. It's like, and I think that's really powerful, like holding mirrors up to organizations and saying, like, you really need to face this if you want to thrive. And I wouldn't have joined an organization that didn't do that. So that then generates like quite different types of work. So it might be something like, okay, there's a whole load of leadership coaching that needs to go on here. It might be a kind of like very common one is, where do you start? Okay, you've held this mirror up, like, where do we start? So quite often we will try and find somewhere where they can start kind of making a difference. We will look at maybe that helping them set up an exemplar and building capability. So I think kind of where we differ is like we're kind of more trying to create that organizational maturity. And as I understand it, I think, like with my understanding of Nava, that if we can help organizations develop that maturity, it actually allows them to get the benefit of being able to use implementers like Nava, and without that maturity, they can't really do it. So, I think the kind of relationship, the work you've done with like USDS is a reflection of, you have a mature organization that allows you to generate lots of benefit, but a lot of work needs to go into enabling organizations to be able to do that. There are other, James and Emma here also from Public Digital, and we have like lots of examples of where we've done that work. So I think as we go into kind of discussions later, we might draw on some more examples of the types of way we help.
Yeah. Time check. Where are we time wise, Cyrus?
We have time for like a few questions.
Yeah.
We're also ready.
Okay. So we've concluded our prepared fireside chat. So we would be happy to take questions from anyone. Yep. Or if you'd rather chat informally at the social hour, that works as well. Kind of leave it up to what folks want to do.
Hi, my name is Tracy Walker. I'm with the Digital Services Coalition, and I wanted to kind of ask a little bit about what you're talking about, the maturity of an organization, how you help them, because that's a lot of what we're trying to do with, like, looking at government agencies, and they're not necessarily looking to industry yet, I think, to say help us, as much as we're like, no, we've got it. But they're kind of at that level, I think, that, the maturity still needs to be built up and stuff. So if you have any examples or anything that like you've done to help an organization that's kind of come to you to say, like, where do you start, and where do they, like, kind of have to hear the bad news before they get to the good news kind of stuff.
Yeah, so I might ask James or Emma to come in a bit, but we have a kind of a sort of service, really, I guess, which is kind of a digital maturity assessment, which kind of is a number of, normally takes the form of some pretty honest conversations with collection of quite often leadership or others in the organization, which enables you effectively to then kind of reflect back to the organization where they are. I'll give one example, and then I don't know if we want to do another, but we work a lot with NHS, so our health service, National Health Service, is divided into a whole load of trusts, and we work with the boards for those trusts. And whenever we work with those boards, we do a series of interviews first to try and establish kind of where they are, and then tailor those sessions accordingly. And a lot of it turns out to be the message, like, digital belongs to all of you. It does not belong to your CTO or your, like, as a leadership group. This is something that you will need to embrace. So that's kind of quite a common message. But I don't know, do either of you want to do another example of a digital maturity assessment?
And if you have an example, can you bring yourself up here? Because we have some people joining virtually. Yep.
Yeah, I will. It's not actually a maturity assessment, but it's a project we did recently, which I think is a good example of bringing that mirror up. So we recently reviewed a big procurement for a government client where they were reviewing the investment decision, and some leadership were a bit nervous about it, saying, is this the right thing to do? So we went and we had a look, we conducted some interviews, we had a look to kind of see what they were trying to do. And the really refreshing thing was that we were allowed the opportunity not just to look at the project, but also to look at the investment process that was judging it. And we sort of found that the project was, essentially sound and in a good place. But some of the ways that the organisation's governance operated had put them at a disadvantage. So they had a particular mandates about spending, whether the project was encouraged to spend all their money when they weren't ready to. They had a particular mandate about trying to get rid of certain kinds of technology, and that had led to some perverse outcomes. So it created a situation where the project team were essentially trying to do the wrong thing in a way to keep the governance mechanism happy. And I think we see that a lot in government. So that was a good example of where we could say, okay, to all sides, this is where this path has taken you, and this is where you need to have a conversation and have a much more healthy, risk-based conversation about how to go forward. And we sort of brought those two sides together. So that's a second example.
So you mentioned having a digital assessment to see where agencies are at. Do you also have a mechanism in place for coaching or road mapping? Once you decide, or once you analyze where an agency is at, where do you go from there?
So I'll start, but so yeah, both of those things, exactly that. So a lot of executive coaching, sometimes individuals, sometimes with teams, a lot of helping people understand what leadership behavior, the kind of leadership behaviors that help an organization kind of create teams and empower teams. And we also, so we've done, I do a non-public sector example actually of a kind of major broadcaster in the UK who are actually not that immature, but we took about 180 of their kind of leaders through a whole set of coaching conversations, I guess, such that they start to lead out some ideas across the whole organization at once. Very often we would kind of take a more focused approach, but because they are relatively mature. And we do quite a lot of masterclasses for organization on things like road mapping. Like people often come and say, well, can you help us build a roadmap? And we'll say, well, no, we'll teach you how to do road mapping. So it's always, everything we're doing is about trying to coach the capability into the organization. Quite often they ask for the artifact, and that's just like a red flag. This is a coaching opportunity. To add any more, James?
Yeah, I'll stand up. I think one of the things that's really important to us about when we do those assessments is that we figure out the actionable stuff for leaders, because you see lots of maturity assessments that will show people what they're lacking. We usually present the results in a kind of now, next, later format to sort of say, yeah, there's a big opportunity for you here. You could go quite a long way, but here are a very small number of things to start with. And often that can be quite a tricky process. It's not unusual to kind of have 30 recommendations. We have to do a really involved editing process to get it down. But we're always aiming to say, here's the first thing that you can do. And then, really balance that carefully, because you need to set for organizations where the ambition could be, but also what's the first step on that. Often that's a kind of, here's a really promising area to get started on, or it's you're missing lots of skills, but this is the one to start with. Or often in the best cases, here are some really talented people, give them this support, because most of the organizations, there are people who have some of the skills, some of the inclinations, and a lot of frustration. Doing that kind of exercise can draw those people out and set them free.
I'm Ryan Kay with Civic Tech Chat. Something I heard that was kind of interesting in the talk was the mention of like the use of data in that conversation. And I think one of the specific examples you mentioned was like reduction of burden, which seems like it could be a kind of complex idea to try to represent in data. So I'd be curious to hear about your experience, one, like approaching that sort of thing, and then how you would like coach organizations in like trying to look at hypotheses that look at things like that.
So this was in the context of a very specific project, which might be helpful for explaining this, but I think there are broader applications. So when we embarked on this project, which because it's a demonstration project, we kind of put out to prospective agencies that to ask them to come forward with interest in working on the project. And one of the criteria was that they had some kind of baseline understanding of a burden. And that was it. We didn't say you have to have this particular quantitative metric or this particular quantitative metric. We asked them to explain what their burden was and why they wanted to work with us to try to reduce that burden so that we would have some kind of baseline to go from. It lowers the barrier to entry because many programs have a lot of data. They're sitting on a lot of data. But if we asked for very specific metrics, we might have missed out on potential opportunity to show a change, a delta, because we were looking for something very specific. So, so for this particular project, we were very open. We just wanted them to what was their perception of their burden? How were they quantifying it, either with quantitative data or qualitative data? And then we looked at it and said, can we use this as a way to, as something that we could then determine if there's a change after. So that's kind of a high level, like burden reduction is very broad. There isn't necessarily one way to do it. I haven't looked into particular scales or standards or different things. There may be some out there, but for the purposes of our project and how we were thinking about it, it's pretty broad and based on how the agency perceives there's burden for them and their participants. So I'm not sure if that answered your question. If you have a follow-up question related to it.
Oh no, I think that got to like
that got to it. I'd be happy to chat more as well about data and such.
I think data can be, and obviously it can be really powerful, stupid thing to say, but I think in terms of like changing an organizational dynamic, it can become really powerful if to help leaders in an organization learn that you don't get things by shouting the loudest or being the most senior. That's a really that's quite a hard maturity journey. I got to the point in Universal Credit where people would just tell off the Director General for Operations when he came back and said, I need you to change this. And everyone would go, well, like no one's going to pay attention to you if you don't have the evidence to back it up. And he kind of got used to that, but that took a long time to get to. I think teams, like encouraging teams to just like, articulate, like we're going to do a thing and this is the problem, or we're going to do a thing, this is the outcome, and like make sure like doesn't matter what it is, have some data point that you can then play back to the organization to say that you did or didn't make a difference, because then the organization begins to learn that okay, it's not just a matter of opinion, and it's really quite transformative, but you've got to start with something.
Yeah, and starting with what people already have is an easier entry point, and then you can build up to this is ideally what we would like to measure, and this is ideally how we would like to start measuring from a baseline and after. But often we have what they believe is valuable and what they want to know, and so so we work with them to use the existing data. Thank you. Any other questions? Or how are we on time now, Cyrus? We're still good?
I think we're
Oh, we're done.
One question if there's
Okay, maybe one more question or
otherwise.
all right, well, thank you all. Um,